Although I enjoy terrifying stories, I tend to protect myself because of my hyperactive imagination. I choose not to watch horror films since I was never able to do so. Even with the least frightening stories, the No Sleep podcast kept me awake. It's funny that I can write about this seriously because of this. For privacy reasons, I will be using alternate names. Due to my dad's work, my family relocated to our little town. Since he works in school administration, our family frequently participates in small town conversations. It felt like the entire town knew before we did when we made the decision to move out of our small rental house and into a 2-story house a block from the school. Brick was crawling around the base of the imposing building, which had a porch in front. It was a simple, clean house, but I say that. Well, aside from the minor warning signs. The room my sister and I would share had 3 closets when we were initially shown the house. Along the back wall, there was one in the center and one on each side. It featured an old-fashioned glass door. The cupboard was completely stocked with dolls when the house's father showed them. Dolls, indeed. Fortunately, the father told us that by the time we moved in, they would all be gone because they were his daughters. My mother even let out a sigh of relief. It wasn't until we moved here that we discovered it had once been a balcony that had been quickly covered. The room was consistently around 15 degrees colder in the winter because they didn't even bother with insulation. Then there's the staircase issue. They make a terrible creaking sound. Around the 3rd from the top, one step is the loudest of all. Sometimes I'll reach the landing and hear that creaking step behind me, but no one will be there. I realize it's cliché. My birthday arrived after we had finally moved in. I wasn't anticipating a party with my pals or anything because it's around Christmas, but surprise, some of them were invited over by my mom. All of my friends had spent their entire lives in the same place. They had all informed me at one time or another that they had always wished to view the interior of the house. In fact, there was a friend of mine who lived across the street. At the celebration, it was she who drew me away. She looked around the house and remarked, "You have no idea how strange this is." "What is it?" I inquired. I heard a lot about this place, what it did. Lowry did, and Lowry did some stuff that I would never do for myself. I hope it's not too terrible. I heard the secret was revealed. I chuckled. "Oh, I understand." She gave me a suspicious look. "Really?" "Yes, the restroom by the garage has undergone some renovations. Our pantry door had weather sealing, according to the man who was conducting the work. Only later was the entire rear part of the home added. My parents' bedroom is most likely where the bodies were viewed after being brought in through that door." She let out a gasp. "Not at all." I gave a nod. At one of the football games, I had the same conversation with my English teacher, the high school secretary, the janitor, and 2 parents. "So you must have heard about the pool, don't you?" I was intrigued by that. "What? The swimming pool?" We were constantly informed about the above-ground pool in the backyard by Hannah, a friend's sister. However, the backyard does not have a pool. Yes, but there was once, according to her, the family that once occupied this house had a backyard pool that was constantly covered with a sheet, even in the summer. She stopped for a second. Hannah claimed that the fact that the tarp was stacked was the most peculiar aspect. It appeared as though something was underneath it. I chuckled. "Like what?" Hannah claimed that it appeared to be bodies. It did every time I watched it. It was also correct. The previous occupants of the house never went swimming in the pool. "Really?" I inquired. "They could have simply added more storage space." I am aware that due to all of our belongings, my mom has 2 extra storage spaces. She gave a shrug. "I'm not sure. Simply said, this area is quite strange. It's a great house, I mean, she told me, but it's strange. I, I gave a head shake. All right, yes, it's peculiar. She mentioned something that I couldn't forget even months after the party. I kept seeing things emerge from beneath the crawl space, from inside the enigmatic closet, and climbing up the steps behind me. I developed a routine. I examined the 3 rear doors, locked. After that, I would lock the kitchen door. When I saw my reflection in the dark, the mirror on the back of the door always made me laugh. I keep hearing from classic horror tropes that I should always be on watch. After that, I repositioned the front door, locked. After bidding my parents good night, head back up the stairs to my room. I shut the door firmly after turning off the landing light. Drafts cause it to shift on the hinges if I don't fully close it, and I wind up sleeping in a cold sweat from terror. I put my phone on the charger and start listening to my sleep playlist. To Ed Sheeran, No Monster Can Kill Me. I then put on my sleeping mask after pulling up my covers. This prevents me from opening my eyes and seeing a demon. Finally, after all of this, I fall asleep, with the exception of yesterday night. Although the school year is done, my dad's job and sports activities have had us cooped up at home for a few weeks. I chose to wash since my sisters would be using their phones for a while and my parents were already asleep. Switched it out and got it going. Every time you turn on the dryer, the fluorescent light above it dims for a while. After that, I went to shut the back doors. Because he can't climb the stairs to reach us, our large dog Patch occasionally sleeps in my parents' first floor room. When he saw I was closing up, he began to scratch at the door to come inside. In the end, he would most likely bark all night. No, Patch, he wasn't a demon, I knew that. Reflecting eyes or something like that would have been visible to me. Then I went to the opposite door, secured with a passcode. The third door opened into the garage. It had an alarm system of its own. A small metal clasp kept it closed, but the sound of opening it could be heard from upstairs. After that, I secured the kitchen door. And my reflection was there. You know, I hesitated for a moment, but I'm not arrogant. After turning off the lights in the kitchen, I make my way to the front door. The windows were not mentioned. I dislike the windows, which is why. There are practically no windows in the house. The repurposed burlap drapes that covered the windows were the first reason my mom liked the house. The purpose of the curtains is not fulfilled. They still allow me to see. I can see in sometimes too. Outside there was movement, but I knew how to handle it. Kill me now if you're going to do it. I heard my parents laughing quietly in their room. They weren't dozing off. I looked at the front door's lock. Locked. Once more, the house was so old that the mere opening of the door was a warning sign. Then I ascended the stairs. 16 steps. When we initially moved in, my younger sister, who was a control freak, had numbered them. All of them. Burst. The sense that something is about to happen is constant. Fear. My sister would have collapsed down the stairs in disbelief if she had said hi at that moment. The fucking step, each and every time. Just to make sure, I glanced over my shoulder. At that moment, I noticed a shadow. I turned, and it was gone. Strange, isn't it? I didn't want to ignore it. Kill me now if you're going to do it. After giving the monster some time, I walked back up the stairs and into my bedroom. According to the wall clock, it was 10:23 p.m. I closed the door. Dang it. I neglected to switch off the light. I was now expecting to see a hand slip beneath the door or the shadow of feet. No, even worse. By itself, the light flicked off. Reaching for my phone was something I was afraid to do. I was unable to feel for my sleeping mask. I was immobilized. My youngest sister was asleep already. It was then that I recalled. My older sister, was she outside? No, I argued to myself. The floor was too old. There would have been a creak. However, my logical mind was attempting to calm me down. It was her, of course. The thinnest member of our family was her. She might have just slipped away to switch off the light. Why would she sneak, though? Had I not heard her door? The air conditioner came on. The draft got underway. The door moved. The gentle hum of the air helped me to relax a little, but the thought of the light kept coming to mind. Why is there so much light? I shut my eyes. I'm not under 3 covers, can I? At least I was covered, even though I was perspiring from the heat. I remained motionless. The house was quiet, the air was running, and everything would be okay. I took a seat. Up until midnight, my sister was watching the kids. She wasn't at home. She had left the light on. Last night, I didn't get any sleep. I am composing this at my aunt's right now, knowing that I will be gone from home for 2 weeks. The timing of church camp is always perfect. I can't stop wondering why Patch yelled for an hour before becoming silent at midnight. This morning, he appeared to be doing well. An American Werewolf in London was the first scary movie I ever viewed. Unlike my older cousin, who was horrified by the transformation scene, I adored it and became hooked on the genre because of it. I can still clearly recall it. With the exception of purchasing the Funkos, which I believe is a waste of money, I embrace all horror. I gathered an entire wall's worth of DVDs devoted to horror movies back when streaming wasn't a thing, from cheese to foreign to classics. I couldn't stop feeling afraid. According to what I've read, terror activates the archaic portion of our brain that is hardly used these days. Being at the top of the food chain, we are rarely in danger of being eaten by saber-toothed tigers or going extinct from the virus like our ancestors were. As a result, we are able to experience the anxiety of almost dying without actually being in danger, thanks to horror movies, computer games, and even rides on roller coasters. Nonetheless, this is a boon to fans of intense horror. People like myself are obsessed with this type of thing and will make a special effort to locate ones that only let you in if you sign a disclaimer. The majority of the extreme haunted houses were not publicized. The best ones were placed in locations that were already eerie and tainted by a shady background, and the majority were set up illegally to heighten the sense of danger. A warehouse where a serial killer tormented homeless people, a hotel where a fire killed scores of people, etc. One of the group members informed us of a new location this year, Goose Creek Sanitarium, a location she asserted will be named the best of the haunted houses. I learned about Goose Creek Sanitarium's troubled past from a little internet search. A fire destroyed it in the late 1970s, and it has lain there collecting mildew and dust ever since. The most recent information I could get about it was a brief report from a tiny newspaper stating that it had just been bought. Apart from that, nothing existed. We've traveled longer than that in our quest for the scariest location throughout the years, but the drive there took a few hours. Sadly, there wasn't much to view on the way there, so I slept for the most of the drive. The automobile was bouncing on a gravel road that hadn't been maintained in decades when I woke up, and it was almost dark. The trees, which resembled skeleton fingers covering the sky and hugging the road, were ideal for a spooky film. The massive 5-story Goose Creek Sanitarium had not been maintained for decades. To prevent its patients from escaping, a black iron fence around it. The individuals that put it up were aware that not much needed to be done to make it more spooky, and they didn't want to destroy it with too many decorations. This made sense to me because, when cooking, A little salt goes a long way, and too much salt will ruin the food. Decorating a space that is already eerie is no different. There weren't many people in the line to enter. They shared our passion for horror. This time, we invited a few of them to join our group chat since we knew them from previous severe haunted places we had visited over the years. We had to sign a waiver just like those other locations. This gave the personnel permission to grab us, tug our hair, and do other things. We had to pass through a weed-filled garden and past shattered statues of angels covered in moss from years of neglect before we could enter the main structure. Not much had to be done to make it eerie, just like the rest of the place. One of the employees seized Renea, one of the original members of the Gorehounds, and fled with her on his shoulders before they could enter the building. Everyone laughed at this, even Renea, who was being carried farther away. Renea's boyfriend, Aaron, laughed and said, "Bring her back when you're done with her." A so-called tour guide who looked like a ghoul that had just emerged from a grave stood at the building's entryway. The guide simply grinned and replied that everything would be revealed later in the tour, when a man in a jacket and shorts questioned why an extreme haunted house would require a tour guide. He took us into each room and told us about the place's history, since they didn't need any. Nobody sprang out of the majority of the rooms to capture us. The building did not require adornment because of its harrowing past. Not only were mentally ill patients treated like animals at Goose Creek Sanitarium, but TB patients were also mistreated there. Every time someone died, they were dropped down a dumbwaiter designed for corpses and taken to the incinerator in the basement. The instructions stated that because the bones would adhere to the wall, the smokestacks attached to the subterranean crematorium would need to be cleaned out each month. Given how harmful the work was to people's lungs, it was assigned to one of the other prisoners. If someone died in the process, they would just be added to the ashes in the chimney. Because of the terrible things I found online about the location, I believed every word of the narrative, even though the rest of the group thought it was nonsense. We then proceeded to the cells following this introduction. Iron bars dropped in the entryway as soon as we exited the lobby, stopping us from going out that way. We all almost shit ourselves at the loud sound of the hefty steel clang. The guide laughed. The main concern when Goose Creek Sanitarium was first built was that someone may break in. For this reason, bars are installed at every window and entry. It made some sense, but I didn't find that in any of the books I read on the place. After all, the state's worst criminals and insane people used to reside here. People on either side of the corridor were shouting and groaning as they reached out to us in the cells. We would try our best to avoid their hands, or simply swap them away when they dragged us in. The guide informed us about some of the well-known killers who had previously resided there while this was happening. Solomon Gideon was the most well-known of them, having murdered 13 people in 2 days. Before he was able to flee Goose Creek Sanitarium due to the strange fire that forced its closure, he lived there for 10 years. We still don't know where he went. Solomon Gideon is a topic for another day, although I could discuss it for days. As I was being told all of this, a man in a filthy medical mask emerged from one of the halls, grabbed the hair of a person I couldn't identify, and pulled him away. The man being pulled away made an effort to resist, but the masked man was not only physically intimidating, but also had the element of surprise. As a result, nobody offered assistance. We did nothing but watch helplessly. All of us registered for this. More bars dropped as we exited the cages, making it impossible for us to go back the way we had come. We passed what I believed to be the mess hall as we descended down into the sanitarium's interior. I received the impression that the asylum had been overrun by the inmates when we first arrived. Wet meat was dangling from cages and hooks on the ceiling. People were pleading for our assistance within the cages. Over their sobs, the guide continued to tell us about the location's history, how the physicians were known to carry out experimental operations and surgeries. The guide grinned and responded that although frontal lobotomies did occur at Goose Creek Sanitarium, there were more worse outcomes when one of the tour members inquired if they were what they meant. The only reason rooms were built was to keep crazy guys sane. It was thought that if anything could drive a normal man crazy, it might do the exact reverse. Flashing lights, extended darkness, sensory deprivation, and being hot, cold, or wet were all examples of this. As we departed, the guide remarked, "The people who had to endure this were even starved." Once more, bars collapsed, making it impossible for us to flee, and I would be lying if I claimed I wasn't afraid of this. Our next trip was one of the operating rooms, which smelled and looked more like a charnel house than a hospital due to the blood that was all over the place. I didn't give this much thought. After all, ground beef and its associated blood are frequently used as decorations in severe haunted houses. After telling us to look around, the guide said we would reconvene in 30 minutes at the surgical room 3. People who wanted to be freed grabbed our garments and hair as we lived in small groups and walked around a bit. Andrew pointed to a person who appeared to have been a prisoner for weeks and remarked, "Their makeup is Hollywood level." Her soiled white outfit accentuated her pale appearance, leading me to believe that she was either a method actor or a recovering drug addict. We saw less of the other groups who were with us as we continued to investigate. We heard screaming every now and then, but we couldn't be positive that it was coming from them or the actors who were shackled to steel gurneys or imprisoned in their cells. About 20 minutes later, I realized the guide was nowhere to be found. The others in my group thought it was just part of the performance, but I was worried about it. Aaron began walking back the way we had come, ignoring the iron bars, and remarked, "He left us, so we would have to escape on our own." We searched for a way out and headed back to where we last saw the guide. We were relieved at the time since, up until that point, it wasn't really frightening. We thought things were going to improve now that we were on our own and had to figure out how to get out. We dispersed to find a route out, but we remained near enough to one another to hear if someone shouted out. After some time, I found myself in a dim corridor with 6 possible routes, including the one I had previously taken. We gathered at the large crossing of the corridors and called out to the other gorehounds. While some of us questioned the hallway's layout, Andrew was quick to look ahead and locate an escape route. One of the women from the other group rushed past the door at the end of the corridor he randomly selected and sprinted past us before he could open it. She made no attempt to halt or provide an explanation, and her expression was one of utter terror. We would have followed her just as fast under normal conditions, but since we had come here to be afraid, we took the route she took. We needed to know what caused her to have such a panic attack, after all. The floor was sticky and there was an echo, but we couldn't see anything in that dim space. Shallow gasps could be heard somewhere nearby. To find our way around, we had to use our senses. We became separated on the way, which was exacerbated when a few actors wearing night vision goggles entered the room, grabbed a few of our hands as though they were part of our group, and led us away from the other people to the exit. We were in the next room, a surgical room designed to accommodate an audience, when the few of us realized that half of the gorehounds were no longer with the others. There was no mistaking the scent of fresh blood. The body of one of the members of the other group was in the center of the room. The surgeon who had been in the cells earlier was standing over her, shackled to the operation table. Debbie reassured us that this was all part of the play, but several of us freaked out when we saw it, that the individual we encountered in line was a fake to give the impression that we were looking at a real person. I clapped inside as she said this. All of us had previously visited extreme horror houses, but we had never encountered anything like that. The sound of someone shouting commands into a bullhorn could be heard in the distance. "Remain where you are," "avoid getting closer," and such sayings. Even a few gunshots were heard. Wondering if this was also a part of the show, we all froze. It didn't suit the rest of the experience. If it was, the surgeon ran out the door toward the shooting after pointing his scalpel at us and telling us not to move. Naturally, I ignored it and turned to gaze into the corridor. When the surgeon began stabbing the officers before being shot down, I realized that this was genuine, even though I had assumed it was all part of the performance. We were released after the police collected everyone's statements following the raid. We don't have much hope of finding Renee and the other missing people alive after 2 years, despite their assurance that they will do everything in their power to find them. Details of what transpired surfaced in the days that followed. 36 persons disappeared, and at least 14 were killed during the 10 days when the haunted home was open. A dishonest prison warden was closest friends with the man who haunted the house. They agreed that in exchange for an undisclosed sum of money, the warden would provide inmates to make the horror experience authentic. 10 dangerous offenders and 8 killers were among those taken from the prison. The worst of it, however, was a well-known cult leader who must have recruited the others and would eat the blood off his sacrifices. I don't know why this individual ever came into being. The man who paid off that warden is one of the 7 individuals who perished in the raid. The others are among the missing. I believe Aaron attributed his own laughter as they abducted Renifer his suicide, which occurred a few weeks after that night. Not formally, the Gorehounds disbanded up shortly after that. We simply stopped keeping each other informed about horror films and other haunted houses. Debbie and I converse occasionally, but never about horror. When we get together, we usually fish and slash or drink in silence. My uncle, with whom I moved in, had a peculiar set of regulations. I had to stay with my great-uncle Jeremy for a summer when I was 12 years old. I was a bit of a troublemaker back then, you see. My parents believed that I might be healed if I spent some time with my stern, sour uncle. I was unaware of the atrocities I would experience that summer, but you can imagine how hard my eyes rolled when my parents told me about their plan. In a way, Uncle Jeremy was a mountain man. He resided in the isolated high pine forests of Montana. Although Uncle Jeremy did appear a little strange to me at the time, he was a homesteader at heart and had created a life that would drive most people wild. As we arrived into my uncle's cottage in the mountains, my dad nearly threw me out of the car. He didn't even wait at the door for Uncle Jeremy to welcome me. I watched as Dad's tiny Prius returned to the dirty dirt road after traveling down the lengthy driveway. I wasn't jealous of the lengthy travel ahead of him, but I was a little upset that I had just been abandoned. We traveled along an incredible amount, and on this day of all days, our bodies were too empty and it felt like we were preparing for entertainment all day long. Given that a Prius is not an off-road car, I was certain that we would eventually become stranded. The lights on the hybrid's tail vanished into the thick woodland. My gaze shifted to the flimsy wooden cabin. This house wasn't what you would assume it would be. It wasn't the picture-perfect log cabin that most people have in mind. The building had clearly seen a lot of use. The chilly winter winds and the scorching Montana heat had worn and discolored the wood. It was evident to me that all of the materials utilized in its construction were from the nearby forest. Similarly, there were no fire hydrants, electrical lines, satellite dishes, or other contemporary conveniences in sight. I realized then that the summer would be less exciting than I had anticipated. I reached up to knock on the ancient door, but I stopped when I saw some significant scratches on the front of it. Bears? I asked myself. I had the unpleasant impression that the pines were watching me. I tilted my head toward the edge of the trees. Something seemed to be beckoning me into the forest. I looked back at the cabin as the doors screeched open. There was a man in the hallway with a big, oily beard and matted gray hair. Since his skin was aged and worn, I assumed it was for the same reason as the cottage. Through the gray film in his eyes, he gazed at me. My father had told me stories about Uncle Jeremy, but I had never met him in person before then. The summer between 7th and 8th grade, my father had been in the same predicament as me. Uncle Jeremy was not a man to be taken lightly, he informed me. You listen to everything your Uncle Jeremy tells you. He is not a man you want to make angry. Even though my father would give lectures, I never felt any hostility as I looked into the withering man's face. Nothing compared to the ferocity my father had described, and he almost appeared friendly. "Hi, I'm Marcus." During the introduction, I put out my hand, but he smacked it away and covered my mouth with his. Watch what he doesn't say. He waved. "Yes." "We don't say names here." To be sure no one or nothing was listening, he pushed my head to the side. I thought more about my great-uncle as my father had described him. Uncle Jeremy is a bit strange, but he has your best interest in mind. Try your best to ignore his lack of civility. Now, everything he had said was beginning to make sense. I believed I heard Uncle Jeremy whisper my name as he shoved me into the cabin. That is, until I turned to see the terrified expression on his face. At that moment, I realized that the sound had come from somewhere beyond the tree line, riding the early summer breeze. I felt the hairs stand on the back of my neck. "Is everything okay, Uncle Jeremy?" As I said his name, his open palm struck my cheek. "Buck off, child. I didn't give you names." With clenched teeth, he spoke before turning back to the forest line. A tiny voice slithered into the cabin, almost like a dream. "Jeremy," the voice called. "What the hell is that?" I asked, but got no response. Uncle Jeremy slammed the door behind him. "Rule number 1, no names." I looked down at his censure. "The second rule is to leave it alone if you hear something odd. Ignore it. Do you hear me?" I consider his directions before challenging his reasoning. Why?" "Those are the regulations. Don't say anything else about it. Do you hear me when I say that you must abide by my rules, or I will send you back to your small life in Boise?" My escape from homesteading became evident at that point. I would return to the gem state if I broke a few laws here and there. The storyline that was developing in my head made me try not to smile. "Your room is down yonder." The elderly man led me to a narrow passageway after pointing me in its direction. We entered a tiny 10 by 10 space. With a sigh of relief, I tossed my backpack onto the bed and settled down just next to it. "Kid, what are you planning to do? This isn't some opulent alpine hideaway." The understatement of the century, like thought. As I peered at the deteriorating wooden walls, he walked to the window and flung the shutters wide, breathing in the pure mountain air as he said, "We have work to do." There was a 2-acre clearing in the woodland outside his line of sight. Fields and livestock, goats, chicks, and 1 cow, more like glorified gardens. He looked at me and saw my expression of disappointment. "Do you believe that this was a freebie?" "No, we work here to pay for our food." I saw the first glimmer of pleasure appear on his face as he said. He opened one of the nightstand's drawers. "I placed these here for you before you got here." I discovered some old tattered overalls in the drawer. "There's a lot to do around here, so put those on and come meet me outside. The sooner we finish it, the sooner we may enjoy a satisfying dinner." I laid in bed later that night, unable to fall asleep. My muscles hurt all throughout. Homesteading is not for the weak, and Uncle Jeremy was telling the truth. We had labored until the sun set, which, in Montana at this time of year, was approximately 9:30 p.m. Along with countless other unfavorable chores, we had weeded the fields, fed the chickens, and milked the dairy cow, whose name I later learned was Bessie. Uncle Jeremy's statement that we would repeat the entire process the next day was the best part of it. In the hopes that it would suffocate me, I covered my face with the pillow. I needed to be put out of my suffering, since I was a beat hound. I left it there as the night began to slowly wash over me, because the warmth of the soft fabric seemed to soothe me a little. I heard scratching coming from the opposite side of the wall, just as I was about to drift off to an uncomfortable night's sleep. It came from the outside. It was a very faint sound, The fact that these walls were solid lumber rather than hollow almost brought back memories of the mice we used to have within our house. To be sure nothing was drowning out the scratching near my head, I pushed the pillow to the side. Create, create, create. It was a rhythmic sound, as though a message were being sent. Keep scratching, keep scratching. It was digging deeper into the cabin's side, whatever it was. The noisemaker was too loud to be a mouse. Perhaps it was a raccoon. Then, like someone scratching at an old chalkboard, the sound grew louder until it was an ear-piercing screech. Screech, screech, screech. I leapt to a sitting position. It had to be a bear. I was terrified of the Montana grizzlies, which is one of the reasons I never went to see Uncle Jeremy in the first place. Earlier that day, I heard the same faint murmur coming from the tree line. But this time, my name hissed through the cabin's crevices in place of Uncle Jeremy's. Meerkats! When I noticed that something was slowly pulling the window's shutters open, my heart fell. Uncle Jeremy, I yelled. I heard a bedroom door slam open from down the hall, then the door to my room. Uncle Jeremy's eyes met mine as he stood there with his .22 in hand. Then he noticed the shutters slowly moving. Leaning the rifle on the wooden wall, he hurried to the shutters and slammed them shut. He turned to face me after hastily locking the latch. Unkster, on the first night, you disregarded both of my rules. As I tried to make sense of what had happened, he yelled at me. I thought things would get clearer the more my uncle spoke, but all he said only left me more perplexed, and to be honest, scared. You did it now, child. It is now engraved on us, and knows our names. How difficult it was to get rid of the previous one is beyond your comprehension. It? The final one? I asked myself. Wait, what are you talking about? I trembled. Never mind that. From now on, you keep these shutters locked here. I didn't need to hear it twice from him. Everything in the house will be secured. Just to be clear, it's not me if you hear me yelling your name. What else could it be? What the hell? Before I could ask a clarifying inquiry, I gave it some thought. What is it? I said, what's my second rule? My uncle gave the order. I thought for a while before answering. If I see something, leave it be. You're correct. Let it be. No more of this. It will just encourage it, and we will no longer discuss it. All of a sudden, I had no desire to carry out my scheme to have Uncle Jeremy send me home. Uncle Jeremy and I went outside to check the side of the wall where the noise was coming from after breakfast the following morning. A Magnum revolver in its scabbard was the weapon Uncle Jeremy was promoting today. I was certain that no grizzly had made the noise when we looked at the marks on the wall. Unlike the scratches on the door, these were not haphazard. No, there was a message in these markings, a mysterious symbol, a circle with 3 jagged lines through it, was painted on the wooden logs. This circle had 2 names on top of it, Marcus and Jeremy. I swallowed as Uncle A closer look was given to Jeremy. He laughed nervously. I'll be back tonight, he spoke in a tone that begged to be untrue. Fear made my stomach turn. The dairy cow Bessie delivered a painful moo. She was obviously bothered by something. Uncle Jeremy turned, his expression gloomy. He stood up and made his approach to the cow on foot. He dropped to one knee when he was only a few steps from her. It's already begun. My jaw fell when I glanced over his shoulder and saw the gore, which still haunts me to this day. Flies feasted on Bessie's fresh wounds as blood mixed with milk, and her mutilated udders had flesh hanging off each protrusion. Poor Bessie, Uncle Jeremy said. I could see he was sad when he watched his cow suffer. I tried to console him, but he got up before I could put my hand on his shoulder. The Magnum was unholstered, and he aimed it at Bessie's head. Every bird in the area flew as one shot rang out. Bessie had passed away. Now she lay in a pool of brain matter and blood. After wiping away a few tears, Uncle Jeremy turned around and walked quickly back to the cottage. "Come on, kid, we have to get ready." I was aware that a battle of some sort was imminent. Uncle Jeremy and I didn't speak when night fell on the cabin that day. We had locked ourselves in the small hut, along with all the animals, a variety of domesticated geese, 7 goats, and 22 hens. He had pushed a weapon into my grasp and instructed me on how to shoot, but he advised me not to use it unless he was in danger. The goats had lost the thrill of being in a new setting, the chickens and geese had gone to sleep, and the night was mostly silent. They were now crowded in a living room nook. It was nearly calm, I would say. Right up until all the animals started screaming at the top of their lungs. Birds were flying all over the house. The majority of the goats now cowered beneath the dining room table as they exploded in a frenzy and ran around looking for whatever hiding spot they could. The hubbub subsided almost as fast as it had started. Uncle Jeremy's expression indicated me he had seen all of this before, but I still gazed at him in confusion. He fixed his gaze on the door. The scraping that we had heard the previous evening slid across the opposite side. Similarly, the scratching became more intense before exploding into a flurry of thumping. As the latch fought to keep whatever was on the other side out, I eyed the door. Soon a voice did the same. "Jeremy, Jeremy, and more Jeremy, Uncle Jeremy, it sounded just like me. My voice was being used as bait by whatever was on the other side for some reason. Uncle Jeremy's voice replaced the original one. Marcus, open the door." Uncle Jeremy raised his revolver to the door after giving me a quick glance. From where we were standing, we could hear one shot and the sound of something striking the ground. Keeping his revolver ready, my uncle stood up and walked to the door. I was unable to summon the fortitude to tell him to stay put. First, he unhooked the top latch, then the bottom. Uncle Jeremy peeked out the tiny slit as the door slowly creaked open. He said something that I will never forget for the rest of my life. "Oh, shit." He was abruptly dragged from the cabin's comforts by a clawed hand that grabbed through the little gap in the door. I couldn't tell if the shouts were coming from Uncle Jeremy or the individual posing as him. Everything fell silent, and I debated whether or not to watch how the skirmish turned out. I felt a wave of comfort wash over me when I heard a voice. "Don't worry, youngster, I have him. On the other side of the door." Uncle Jeremy appeared to get up and I heard him grunt. However, my heart fell when the door slowly opened. My uncle wasn't the one. He had been seized by the beast. It had a tall, slender frame, pale skin, and a face. Well, no face. Just a simple identity. However, a mouth started to open as it turned toward me while standing there. Like big wads of gum, skin adhered to its top and lower jaws before being replaced by sharp teeth. It repeated itself in my uncle's voice. "Marcus." He started to run, and a revolver round spit out as it was only a few steps away from me. In a green puddle of blood, the creature fell to the ground. Uncle Jeremy, who was injured, was standing at the door. No matter how capricious Uncle Jeremy's regulations were, I had no trouble adhering to them after that night. Throughout the summer, we worked on his homestead, and I never once brought up his name. Even though I was never one to follow rules, I was not going to call forth another creature in this particular situation. I never brought them up, even though I would occasionally see objects dart over the tree line. My Uncle Jeremy was a model citizen, and at the end of the summer, I was determined not to spend another day with him. I learned of my great Uncle Jeremy's passing 10 years later. Since he was old, I initially thought he was elderly, but my father told me that a bear attack had killed him. Was a bitch's hard son, and a bitch's hard son deserves to go out like a man, I told myself. However, I began to wonder if a bear was the true culprit. The beast that used to call from the opposite side of the cabin walls came into my mind. Its jagged claws and blank face came to mind. I got a letter in the mail the day before I was scheduled to depart for his funeral. Uncle Jeremy's P.O. box was the address from which it was sent. I thought Dad had given me something in his will, but when I opened the letter, I only discovered one piece of paper. The same circle that Uncle Jeremy and I had discovered, carved on the opposite side of the cabin walls, was written in blood. With equally sharp lines, I noticed that the same two names were inscribed at the top of the circle. Uncle Jeremy's was the only one crossed out this time. I noticed a slight scratching sound coming from the opposite side of my Idaho home at that very moment. One of them discovered me. I'm not sure how. Downvote 38 go to comments, share. Upvote 1.8K.